Rates and Budget Measures Bill.
Amy Adams.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I'm delighted to stand here on Budget Day and take a call on the first reading on the Taxation Annual Rates and Budget Measures Bill, which is the bill, of course, that delivers on the key revenue changes that make up this year's budget. Mr Speaker, in 2008, Michael Cullen stood in this House and told New Zealand that after the best global economic times in living memory, the Labour Party had been so incompetent, such poor economic managers, so financially illiterate, that he was deserting the ship, leaving a decade of deficits as his legacy. Decade of deficits. The numbers don't lie. The Labour Party left New Zealand with 10 years of having to borrow from the world to pay the bills because under their stewardship, the productive sector had been decimated, businesses and taxpayers had been kicked time and time again, and the only sectors that grew were the public sector and their good mates in the unions. Because when it comes to New Zealand, the Labour Party will always look after their union mates before the hard-working people of New Zealand. OK, now we've dealt with the mess that Labour's left, the unfunded commitments, the gaping hole in ACC and the export sector in massive decline, and we've dealt with the fallout from the global financial crisis, and of course 2 earthquakes in Canterbury that are equivalent to 8% of our GDP. And yet today, in this House, Bill English has delivered a balanced, responsible and prudent budget that is right for our times and that is going to set New Zealand further along the path to recovery. This budget, Mr Speaker, was about reducing debt, it was about supporting growth, and it was about paying for the rebuilding of Canterbury. Now let's have a look at those things. Reducing debt. At the moment we're borrowing a staggering $380 million a week. Now I defy anyone to stand here and tell us that that is sustainable. It is not. With what we have heard today, that figure, sir, will drop to $100 million a week from next year. We've still got work to do, but that is a significant gain. That's money, sir, that our children and grandchildren won't have to repay in years to come. One of the stats that jumped out at me was that compared to Labour and the forecast that they left, this government will be borrowing $45 billion less than the top numbers that the Labour forecaster left. $45 billion less, and that's before we costed any of the election promises they're already starting to throw around. Mr Speaker, this budget alone, just today's budget, has meant that over the next 4 years we're borrowing more than $10 billion less than we would otherwise have borrowed. That's what these changes mean. They mean $10 billion over 4 years that we don't have to go out and borrow from the Chinese, from the rest of the world, and that my children and everyone else's children won't have to pay back in years to come. And on Christchurch, sir, this budget has put $5.5 billion into the Canterbury Earthquake Recovery Fund, on top of the $3.3 billion that we'll be paying through EQC and ACC. That's $8.8 billion set aside, funded, committed, that the people of Canterbury know is there to help them through their time of need. Now, what's really interesting to me is the Labour Party stand in this House and talk about exports. I can't believe that David Cunliffe can stand in this House and have the barefaced cheek to talk about supporting exporters when it's clear to everyone that their intention is to get back on their old hobby horse of taxing and regulating exporters into extinction. You only had to look at Stuart Nash's comments yesterday to know exactly what their intentions are for the productive sector of New Zealand. And let's look at the Greens. I was staggered to hear Russell Norman say that the government had to lift its revenue when every single proposal for productive economic growth that's come before this House, the Greens have voted against. They've voted against it, and yet they stand here and talk about the need to lift revenue. Well, I ask both of those parties, if the 13% of New Zealanders that pay more than half the tax in this country go away, who's going to pay for the handouts? Who's going to pay for the grants? Who's going to pay for the bureaucrats that those two parties stand up and support? It is head in the sand ostrich country, and it's time they wake up and stop threatening this country with the inevitable bankruptcy that their economic mismanagement would bring. They need to wake up. They need to start realising that we have to have a productive engine room in this country. We have to support growth. We have to support skills. We have to get in behind our export sector, not bag and kick them through capital gains, through higher taxes and through continued regulation. Mr Speaker, that's what this government is about, and I, for one, am so proud to be part of this John Key-led government, supporting the budget, the bill English delivered today, a budget that's going to rebuild Canterbury and get this country back on a path to growth.
Mr Speaker.
Honourable Clayton